Like we've been saying, explicit phonics instruction involves a very specific, systematic, explicit approach. What I'm going to walk you through here is a 5-part routine for phonics instruction, which is based on the Orton-Gillingham methodology. And this is, again, one very efficient way to deliver explicit phonics instruction to students. It's not the only way, but if this is the way that you are teaching your students reading, it's going to be wonderful. And if there's another way and you want to just sort of adopt a few parts of this routine, that's also awesome. All right, let's get right into it. The first part of a routine is introducing a new sound card. You may not introduce a new sound card every day, every session, every lesson, but we do introduce new sound cards. And this is sort of prior to that 5-part routine. This is something that we do before that. What's really fun and beautiful about introducing a new sound card is that we can do this as we bridge the phonological with the phonemic. And what I mean by that is the phonological sort of lives only within what students are hearing and what students are saying, right? Think of an activity where a teacher might hold her 2 fists together and app, app. So if I take away the and I put a k, what does that say? K, app, cap, right? Students did not see any letters there. They were living strictly in the phonological. They were hearing and they were saying and they were manipulating just the sounds that they were hearing. So that is strictly phonological. When we bridge the phonological with the phonemic, we can use some phonological and we can introduce the phonemic. And we're going to watch this teacher explain this through modeling.
Ow. Ow. House. Mouse. Out. Ouch.
So we can see here very clearly that the teacher is using some phonological and some phonemic awareness. I'm sorry, let's go back to the slide before. I apologize for that. Here we go. She's showing them phonemically the new sound card, but she's using phonological awareness of sounds that she's not showing phonemically to introduce them to sound, to words that may include this sound. Because to just hold it up and say, ow, may not mean something to the child. We want them to internalize what sound this makes. So we give them cues and clues using phonological awareness. What we're going to see here is step 1. Step 1 is visual to auditory. The teacher is showing a card to the student and the student articulates the corresponding sound. The teacher can also have the students air writing during this time. It's optional. Teachers love this activity because students will, first of all, it's multisensory. We love that. But students can also show that they are practicing and encoding these sounds at the same time. We want to remember that we're checking here if students have mastered articulating the corresponding sound. When we have a consonant sound, we want to make sure that students are not adding a short U, right? If we have a B, a B, we're showing the students a B. We don't want to hear B because there is no U there. We want students to realize right away with our immediate feedback that that does not say B. That would just say B. Also, we want to use cards that we have already taught. We want to include the new sound, but we also want to include review of sounds that were already taught. We don't have to necessarily include all of the sounds. That might take a while. If we have time, then that's great. But teachers can strategically insert the cards that students are having a hard time with here. All right, let's see how this goes first without air writing, and then we're going to watch it with air writing.
Ow.
ing, all, ch, a, r,
And we can see how she's working through each of these cards. Now we're going to watch what it looks like. The same exact approach, the same exact step, except the child is going to be air writing as she's saying the sounds.
ow, ing, all,
And we can see that that added step of air writing these words is giving this child just another memory channel for eventually when she will be encoding these words as well. And when I say encoding again, I mean spelling or writing these words. So this concludes step 1. Here we have step 2, which is auditory to kinesthetic. Kinesthetic can also leak into tactile. They're both covered in this step. The difference between kinesthetic and tactile may be that kinesthetic uses gross motor skills, tactile uses fine motor skills. They're both creating a way for a student to show the teacher which letter represents the sound that the teacher made through a multisensory approach. And we're going to look at some of the available multisensory approaches that we can easily make. But this child is simply using a whiteboard. She's encoding, she's writing the letter that represents the sound that the teacher is making.
Ah. Good. Can you erase it? Let's try another one. R. Beautiful. Erase it. Ooh. Good. If your student is having trouble hearing what sound you're making, you can put 2 fingers on your chin and enunciate. Ooh. Good. Can you erase that?
So we can clearly see here how the child is writing the sounds that the teacher is making. And I want to stop here for a second because we're going to view now an opportunity where the teacher had to give the child immediate feedback. Immediate feedback is where we see an error that the child makes and we tell them immediately. We never want a child to go home thinking that they did something correct if they did something incorrect, because then they'll build that and they'll have a habit of that, and then we'll have to break that later. So as soon as we see something that we can give immediate feedback for, we give that child immediate feedback, and we're going to watch that here.
Beautiful. I noticed that you used the capital C. If we're not writing somebody's name or we didn't just start a sentence, how would we write the sound? Beautiful.
Now, it's important to note that we are not teaching capitalization here. That's not what we're doing necessarily in a 5-part routine, but we can use the opportunity to give immediate feedback because, again, we don't want that child to go home thinking that that's how we make the ch sound. Because really, if it's not a name or if it's not the starting of a new sentence, it shouldn't be a capital C. If your child is not ready for this, if your child really is struggling and really you're just focusing on the phonemic representation, then you may not choose to do this at this time. It's of course up to your best judgment as the teacher what the child is ready for here.
Cool. Beautiful.
And the teacher continues with more sounds until she has reviewed all the sounds, including the new sound that they just learned that day. This concludes step 2, auditory to kinesthetic. And now we're just going to view some multisensory activities that you can use in your classroom. And it's not limited to these options. Of course, if you have other ideas, those are all really great. We want to make sure that we're only using lowercase letters. Again, we're not going to be saying the B sound and then the student is writing a capital B. because that's not naturally in the way that we write. Again, unless we're using a grammar rule that tells us that it needs to be capitalized, but that's not what we're learning here. So if a child is writing a capital letter, we explain to them explicitly, again, just like you saw the teacher, unless we're writing a name or we're starting a sentence, we're not using a capital letter. We're going to use a lowercase letter. Can you try that again? Can you represent that again? We have here air writing. Some classrooms don't necessarily have the means to, pull out shaving cream or sand or whatever it is. So having students air write is really, really helpful. Remember, that's not a plan B. That's really great. The student is air writing and the teacher is of course checking to make sure that the student is air writing correctly. Students will get used to that backwards thing that happens when the teacher is looking at the child and the child is writing it backwards, but the teacher will get used to that. And this you can do on a bus. This you can do, in line while you're waiting somewhere. So this is really easy and flexible. We can use shaving cream writing, Ziploc bag writing. Ziploc bag writing is just where you take a Ziploc bag, a gallon size, you put some sort of mush inside, you close it really well. You may want to tape it. And then the child either uses their fingers or use a Q-tip to write out the sound, the letter that the sound, the letters that represent the sound the teacher is saying. Students can use sand writing. And just it's important to note here that the most convenient way to do this is with a meal prep container. So we have those circle black bottomed containers with a clear top, and you really just need a very little amount of sand. What's nice about those containers also is that the bottom is black, so you can use a colored sand or a white sand or natural looking sand, which I love to do. And you don't need two colors for that because we do have the balance of those two colors already. But if you're using a plate, you can just put two different color sands and you really need very little. As soon as the child finishes writing that letter with their fingers, they shake it out very quickly, very, very subtly, right? We're not shaking it. We're not spilling the sand everywhere. They're really just giving it a little shake and everything goes back to a blank canvas. So these are just great options for students to be using their fingers, be using their multisensory memory channels while we're doing step 2. The next step we call step 2.5, which is the vowel intensive step. This is often overlooked, and specifically with students who are struggling or students with dyslexia, this is a very, very important step for them. We start off using this with just short vowel sounds. Eventually, we can use other vowel teams and different parts of words as well, but we do always want to be careful when we are doing the step, because if we are using that short sound, that short vowel sound, we want to make sure not to use any welded sounds. For example, back, clearly that has a short A in it, but bank, right? Or rank, that is not a short A anymore. That's a welded sound. So that's different. We want to definitely make sure we don't do that. Or like the word saw, right? I saw a cat. So that A is also different. We can't expect that child to isolate that A and call it a short A, of course, because it's not. So we definitely want to be careful with the words that we choose here, but we can choose nonsense words or pseudo words. Those are words which are not, they don't mean anything to the child necessarily, but they do contain that sound that we're looking for. So we are more than welcome to use that here. We're just going to watch this activity here. I think that once teachers watch this activity, then they understand it, they get what's going on here. And it's a very easy activity to do. And it's really, really efficient in helping students decode and encode using that isolation technique.
Good. Let's try to say the sound as we bop it. Let's try that one more time. Cat.
Ah.
Good. Bus. Good. Fish. Amazing.
I just want to point here out, I guess the obvious, but the teacher is saying the word, the child is bopping on that letter, on that vowel, and the child is repeating just the short vowel sound. She's not repeating the word. She's just isolating and repeating that short vowel sound. There's a lot going on here.
Bridge. Good. Spusk. Amazing.
And one more thing that I want to point out is bridge. That's a pretty hard word, right? There are a lot of sounds in that word which are represented in a specific way. This child did not learn that yet. She can't necessarily tell you that there's a BR blend in the beginning of that word or that it ends in a DGE, right? She can't necessarily tell you that, but she can still use that word because she learned her short vowel sounds. So she can still isolate that I in the middle of the word bridge. So we can use words that the child didn't learn the sounds for yet, as long as we're just expecting them to use that sound that they did learn.
Good job. Flob.
ah,
Good. Rest. Good. Plast. Good. Smudge. Amazing.
And the teacher continues, and that concludes step 2.5. And like we said before, technically we can also do this with an activities, which would maybe include different AI or AY sounds within a word. So maybe we would have the AI card here and the AY card here, and the teacher would say play. And through repetitive exposure and through lots of practice, or maybe learning the specific rules of which one is in the middle, which one is in the end, students will practice isolating that as well. We definitely need to be more careful with those because students may technically write that sound does say A. So if the child bops the AI for a word that really it's AY, can we say that it's incorrect? It's a little more difficult, right? Because it does say A. So here it's very specific. It would only be this short vowel sound. So a lot of teachers like to just keep this for the short vowel sounds. But some teachers like to stretch it for other sounds that they will teach as well. The next step is step 3, where we isolate and stretch. The teacher uses the cards that she set up originally in step 1 when the teacher was going through the sounds, and she makes sure to put the beginning sounds at the beginning, the ending sounds at the end of the word, at the end of this isolating and stretching. If there's a welded sound that they taught already, like we see here in the image, eind, she's going to strategically get there when she's supposed to get there, and we'll see that in the video. She sort of gets there too quickly, so she puts it back and she works with it. So you definitely want to make sure that your X's are at the end, right? Your W's are at the front. We don't want to put a W at the end because then again, our A is not A anymore. So we want to be careful with what we're doing there, especially with R's. If we have an I in the middle and R at the end, that, that's not exactly a short I anymore either. So while we're setting these cards up during step 1, and eventually teachers will get used to this, but we do want to make sure that we're strategically placing them in the correct areas.
Okay, Rena, we're going to isolate and then stretch to make the full word.
chat,
Beautiful.
flats,
Beautiful.
quack,
Yes.
quit,
It's important to note here that if a child is isolating correctly, but they're not stretching correctly, that's a flag for us to include onset and rhyme. And we don't call it that for students, of course. We might call it a family, right? Find the family first and then go back and decode it. So what I mean by that, if a child is isolating beautifully and they're isolating for qu, eh, p, and then they stretch and they say quan, right? And that's sometimes confusing for a teacher. It's actually just a child telling the teacher, hey, I need help with that ending blending the end of this word, stretching the end of the word, because it's too abstract for them. So what we do is we cover the beginning, we cover that qu, and we tell them, well, okay, well, this is easy for us to decode, an I and a P together. We don't necessarily say that to them, but if we have this card, the I card and the P card next to each other at the end of a word, what does that say? Ip. Perfect. Ip. You did that beautifully. Ip. Ip. Right? We can isolate that sound, those sounds, and then we can stretch it for that smaller word, which is a lot easier for the child than the entire word. And then once we've done that, we can call that I and P, we can call it the IP family. We never want to introduce it as the IP family. We're not going to bring a card out which has an I and a P on it and say this is the IP family, because we want them first to understand that we're still decoding phonemes. We're still decoding these sounds as I, P, because then if we put a T at the end, or an N at the end, they can still do that. They don't have to only live within the IP family. They can also do this for in. They can also do this for it with a T, right? So we want to show them that we're going to first decode the end of this word, and then we're going to go back and we're going to include that beginning sound. So we can say ip. Good. If this says ip, then what does the full word say? We know that the beginning sound is qu. So if the ending is ip and we have qu, oh, quip. And you'll see that students will work very well with this. And students may not need to do this for very long. It's just a matter of transitioning them to be able to decode the full word.
Beautiful.
It, mix. It, hit. X, hicks. X, hacks. Ash, hash. Dash, dash.
Oh, we're not ready for that one yet.
Ash, cash.
Good.
At, cat. But at, that. The, a.
Does that sound like something?
But I'd find.
Nice. Good job. I love that. Can you do that one more time?
But I'd find.
Amazing.
Again, there's that immediate feedback. We're giving immediate feedback for the error that we see happening.
But aid, bang.
And the teacher is using the new sounds. The teacher is using sounds that were already learned here, strategically using ones that students might have trouble with. And this concludes step 3, which is isolating and stretching. We can, of course, use nonsense words here. Some teachers like to have students do a thumbs up, thumbs down. Is this a real word? Is it a nonsense word? And this is definitely a very important step. Like we said before, explicit phonics instruction involves decoding and encoding at the same time. When we learn a sound, when we learn to decode a sound, we're also learning to encode that sound. So using the same exact sound cards, step 4A will have the child build the words using the cards. And as always, we're constantly giving immediate feedback. What we like to do here is we have the child build the word. Then we ask the child, okay, great. Now can you isolate and stretch to check yourself to see if you encoded it correctly? Very often the child will then pick up on their own mistake, which is a great way to teach children to be independent with their spelling, to be independent with their encoding, so they don't constantly have to raise their hand and say, how do you spell this? How do you spell that? They can do it themselves, and then they even check themselves. And then maybe if something doesn't make sense, maybe they'll call for help. But we want them to be able to navigate this on their own.
Wish. Wish.
What happened here? Let's start again.
Wish. Wish. Can you isolate and read the word for me? That means isolate each sound separately and then read the word.
It. Wish.
I noticed that you isolated and you said, what if? There are 2 sounds there. Is there a way for us to show sh as one sound? Okay, let's check. Can you isolate and stretch?
What is wish?
Yes, perfect. Okay, can you put those cards back? It's okay if they're not exactly in the right order. Great. Okay. Yes. Can you isolate and stretch?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay, can you put them back? Great. Clock. Clock. Nice. Can you isolate and stretch?
Clock. Clock.
Beautiful.
And of course, as usual, the teacher gives immediate feedback. The teacher is using only words that the student already mastered the sounds for. So if the student mastered blends, the student mastered digraphs, and the student mastered that short vowel sound in the middle, then we can give them the word clock. We may not be able to give them the word claim if they didn't learn that AI vowel team yet. So we definitely want to make sure to be careful to use only the sounds that students already mastered. And this concludes step 4A. In step 4B, we're using encoding again, but this time instead of using sound cards, the child is going through an entire dictation activity. Generally, a dictation includes sounds, words, and sentences. And of course, the star here is that we're making sure to provide immediate feedback.
I noticed that you use the capital C. If we're not writing somebody's name or we're not starting a new sentence, how would we write sh?
It's important to note here that students are given gel pens and flare pens and fun colored pencils possibly, but we're not giving them pencils here with erasers. We don't want them to erase. We want them to see that they crossed something out and then they wrote it correctly. We want that message to get delivered immediately, right? This is very different than a traditional spelling test, let's say, where the students write down the words, the teacher collects it, she marks it maybe 2 days later, gives it back. The child doesn't really understand or know what they did incorrectly, and there's not really any learning experience there, unless maybe they go back later and correct it. But here we're giving the child immediate feedback. We saw something that was an error. We're going to tell the child right away so that the child can know immediately that that's an error and they can see how to correct it.
Great.
For every sound or word or word within a sentence that the child gets correctly, we're going to show them that they got it correctly. You can put a check on top, you can underline it. It doesn't necessarily matter what exactly you're using to show the child that they got it correct, but it's really helpful for the student to see that behavior, to see that check, to see that mark, and then know that they got it correct. And you'll notice that when a teacher, here you'll see it in the video as well, when a teacher forgets to put that mark, the child really wants that mark. The child will stop the teacher and say, hey, you didn't give me a mark. It's really important for them. And you only give them the mark if they really did it correctly. And here, if you notice, the teacher did not give that child the mark that showed them that they did it correctly when they used that capital C. Probably this teacher knows that this child specifically is struggling with that. So she was going to use this opportunity to remind the child explicitly of the rule of using a capital C. Some teachers like to include the rule of small, tall, and fall letters. So for example, if a child is meant to write a P, which falls under that line, right? The lowercase p falls under the line, and maybe they didn't, maybe they made the P lowercase, but maybe it's, way too high up. So then the teacher can use this as an opportunity to point that out. Oh, I noticed that your P stands above the line. If we have a lowercase p, it's supposed to fall under the line. Can we try that again? So we're using immediate feedback for other things besides for necessarily phonics. As long as the child is ready for that. Again, if we're working with a child who's really struggling through these phonics skills, we may choose not to do that at this time, but it is something that we can use the opportunity for.
Eind. All. Great. Is there another way we can write? I noticed that you wrote a capital C. If we're not writing somebody's name or we didn't just start a new sentence, how would we write? Yes. Can you think of another way that we can write? Great. Let's go to.
If you noticed when she was writing this last sound here, she was about to use a capital C and she stopped herself and she went lowercase. This just shows how beautifully and quickly something like this works. Immediate feedback. The child started here in one way. She made the same mistake again. And by this point right here, she's already internalizing the difference and internalizing the correct way. Will she make this mistake again? Likely, but we're already working through this error. We're already working through this habit that this child has.
The next line. Shh. Ah. If. Look at my mouth. I'm going to put 2 fingers on my mouth. Are you ready? Beautiful. Sp, sp. Perfect. All right, now we're going to write some words. Oh, thank you. Thanks for pointing out that I didn't give you that dot. I know that these dots are really important to you. Great job, Rena. All right, here we're going to write some words. Listen carefully. Chat. And notice that you use the capital C. If we're not writing somebody's name or we didn't just start a new sentence, how can we write the word chat? Beautiful. Wind. Wind. Shop. Shop.
If you noticed, again, I'm going to point this out. Here she used the capital S again. Here she used the capital S again, possibly here, right? The teacher maybe missed this one, or maybe she skipped over it on purpose. But by the time we got here, we have here a lowercase s. This is really important to note. We want students to realize the behavior and how to fix that behavior. When I say behavior, I just mean the act of encoding, right? What are we choosing? What are we writing?
With. Look at my mouth. With. Oh, I see. This T looks a little bit like a C. So I read ch. This T definitely looks like a T. Are you able to try this again? Representing the T so that it can be read. Beautiful. Casp. Casp. Beautiful. Clasp. Clasp. Rock. Rock. Okay, now we're going to write 2 sentences. I'm going to say the whole sentence 2 times. If you need me to repeat it again, let me know. You ready? Okay. I got a black rock. I got a black rock.
I just want to point out that during the sentences time, we're making sure again to use only words which include sounds that were already learned And if we're using a word that's non-decodable, which we'll get to soon, but if we're using a word that's non-decodable, such as the word the, right? That the doesn't have a short U, it has an E. Technically, if if the student population is saying the with an open syllable E, then that's not a non-decodable word. But again, if we're using non-decodable words, we want to make sure that those are ones that the student has already learned. We never want to give students a curveball here. We don't want to give them something that we're not sure that they know how to decode or to encode.
Beautiful. All right.
Notice that she didn't correct the period. The teacher is very strategically doing something here. She's using things that the child is struggling with, but only to a certain extent. She's using opportunities. She's not using some other opportunities, probably for a reason. So again, the teacher can really do a lot during this dictation. And if a teacher thinks that the child is ready for that step, she may say, when we end a sentence, what do we put at the end of a sentence, right? And then that child would immediately put that period, and maybe that's something that the child would internalize. Okay, so this pretty much concludes step 4B, which is encoding using writing, right? We're not building words using cards anymore. We're using a dictation activity. If the teacher, this is important, if the teacher sees that she gave the child a word and the child struggled with that word once, struggled twice, struggled the third time, the teacher is not going to keep going. The teacher is going to take a note for herself that this child needs that skill taught again explicitly. And the teacher will be very careful with the feedback she gives the child. We don't want to tell the child, okay, great job, we're going to move on now, because that's confusing for the child. We want to tell the child, you did a good job trying, or I'm so proud of how hard you're working. We'll review this sound later. We want to make sure that the child got the message. We need to review this again later. This was incorrect. Don't go home thinking that this was correct. And step 5, we want to see the child read a full sentence using the sounds that they learned. If a child is able to automatically, using automaticity, right? If the child is able to decode the words automatically, then they're building fluency, and then with fluency comes comprehension. So a child can show that they're able to decode automatically by showing us that they can comprehend what they're reading. If a child is reading the word clock and they're really working through each and every one of those sounds, so it's k, kl, kal, killa, kla, kl, clock. By the time they decode that word, they will probably not be able to tell you that it says clock and then point to a clock, right? Because they're not automatic yet. They're not reading that word fluently yet. So here we're going to watch this student work through these sentences, and we're going to see how the teacher again gives immediate feedback.
I sat on a table. Music is fun. Let's go. He had a fever. Thermometer. Open the box. Six minutes is 6 zeros.
Do you want to try that one more time?
6 minutes, 6 is 0.
I hear that you're saying minutes. Can you slow down and isolate the sounds in that word?
6 minus 6 is 0.
Beautiful.
A spider sat on next to me.
Let's try that one more time.
A spider sat next to me.
Okay, and of course, some students will try to do this very quickly because they're excited, they have full sentences, they're really proud of themselves here, but we want to slow them down and remind them we still have to decode each of these sounds. We have to isolate if we are not automatically decoding well enough yet. And students definitely benefit again from that immediate feedback. This concludes the 5-part routine. And again, this is one wonderful, efficient way to